All right, we are working through 25 basic Bible studies, Francis Schaeffer, and this evening we are now talking about Christ's humiliation and exaltation. All right, so the work of Christ is multidimensional, meaning in the past we've been talking about him being a prophet, priest, and king. I think that's what was last time. That was the topic of him being a king, and that's sort of a historical framework. Even the Westminster Standards talk about Christ in the way that he was a prophet, in the way that he was a priest, in the way that he's a king. And this is sort of broader than that. It's his humiliation. And what we mean by humiliation is not necessarily being embarrassed, but his humiliation meaning his coming lowness, his stooping down, as Calvin puts it, to baby talk. God baby talks us. He goo goo gagas us. And that's how he reveals himself. And then, of course, Christ's exaltation is a result of that afterwards. So those are the two aspects, his work as a whole. There's a lot of ways to frame it. Obviously, as we mentioned, prophet, priest, king. But you can also divide it up into these categories of humiliation and exaltation. And it is a fact, I think, that everyone is quite familiar with the humiliation part, because we as Christians love the cross. We celebrate it, we adore it. Sometimes we wear it around our necks. But the exaltation part is often overlooked. You'll hear far more about Good Friday than, for example, Ascension Day, where when Christ ascends to the throne, maybe it's because of eschatological differences. I don't know. I'm sure there's other factors, but a lot of people will ignore what we mean by Christ being exalted on high, him being the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days, as Daniel 7:13 and 14 put it. So let's talk first about Christ's humiliation, and if you have the sheet in front of you, we'll walk through that. But John 17:5 kind of kicks us off here, and it says, "Now, Father," this is Jesus's what we consider his high priestly prayer. "Now, Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was." This is a good text to point out the fact that he has glory. Christ had glory before he became a man, and he had glory with God before the creation of the world. So Jesus was not a created being, in other words. This verse totally refutes that people who struggle with the humanity of Christ or the deity of Christ or both. This verse sort of puts that to rest. He had glory before the world was. Before there was ever a creation, Christ possessed the same glory, the same homoousios, the same substance as the Father, because he is God. He is God. And then Paul in Philippians 2 speaks of the kenosis, the emptying of himself. He says about Christ, who, although existing in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a slave, by being made in the likeness of men. When he came into the world, Christ humbled himself. And that phrase about not regarding equality with God to be a thing to be grasped, I think we just talked about that actually recently in our Apostles' Creed series. But that simply means that he didn't exploit the fact that he was God. He didn't sort of leverage that fact in order to then, create some sort of scenario that's more favorable for him. He didn't. In fact, Paul says he took on the form of a slave. He became a slave, considered the lowly of lowlies, and he became a man. So he humbled himself, and the Creator, the one who spoke all things into existence, that's Christ the Word, he became a man, he became a servant, he became a slave. So think about the contrast in these two verses there with John 17:5. He is in heaven with God the Father in glory, but then he descends down to the dust by taking on dust. Right? Man is a dirt bag. He is a pile of dirt that walks around dirty. It's sort of like what Jesus said. It's not what goes into a man that pollutes him, defiles him. It's what comes out of him. Because man is a dirtbag. But Jesus became a man, and so that's his humiliation, his humbling in that sense. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So the Creator God, that you have to go back to verse 3 in the Gospel of John, the Creator God took upon himself the form of a man. And by the way, don't get tripped up by that word form, because it just simply means the appearance of man, not like that he was an apparition, that, oh, he was just a spiritual being who looked like a man. Those are heresies that existed in the first century and frankly still do to this day. He did not just appear as a man, he was a man. He became flesh and dwelt. It's well known that that verb, well, it is a verb, but that word is where we get tabernacle from, skeneo. He actually was in his flesh here with us like a tabernacle. I was trying to remember after I said that, I'm like, I don't know if that's true. The word I said, I'd have to double check the word that's used there. But that's the idea. Dwelling among us is like he tabernacled here with us. So he became flesh. He was flesh and blood. He was a real man. Luke 2:7. And she, this is talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus, gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the guest room or the inn. When Christ was born, he was not born in a great human family. He was born in a very poor family. Right? When God became a man, he wasn't Caesar's son. Caesar thought himself to be God and the Son of God. But that's not where Jesus came. He came from a poor family. When he was born, the Bible emphasizes that he didn't even have a home to shelter him. He didn't have a room available to him. He was born in a manger, in a stable, which that's not like we think of stable as something detached from a house, but in the first century house, you actually would go in, and on that first floor, you would have the animals. They would be brought into there. So, and when that happened, that's where Jesus was born. He was born sort of on the first floor. Everybody else lived upstairs. So that's important for Christian theology, because when we talk about God becoming man, he did become very low, so low that not only was he born of a virgin who was not married but betrothed, he became a part of a family that really just didn't have money. They didn't have wealth, fame, status. You know, everything the world thinks is of greatness, he had none of it. John 7:52. They answered him, "Are you also from Galilee? Search and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee." So Christ did not even come to a respected portion of the country, but from Galilee. Remember, can anything good come from Nazareth? Can anything good come from any of those places? Galilee was looked down upon. It was not really considered a very Jewish place. In fact, Mark brings this out in his gospel, but Galilee is really the place of the Gentiles. And of course, Jews did not enjoy them. Mark 6:3, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they were taking offense at him. So his family was not one of the great ones of the community. Remember, Joseph was the husband of Mary, and he was a carpenter, and Jesus followed in his trade. Likely, Jesus was quite adept at swinging a hammer. He was quite good at that. But the point is carpenter could also mean he could have been a bricklayer, a stonemason. I mean, he could have had a broader than just a guy who built houses out of wood, like we think of it today. But the point being, of course, is that he did not have this sort of high respected family that people looked up to. Galatians 4:4, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." So the great lawgiver places himself under the law. It makes sense that God would do it this way because he's also fulfilling everything he said beforehand. He's fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant. He's fulfilling the promises he made to Abraham and Noah and David and Adam and everybody in between. He was born under the law, meaning he was born as a Jew from the tribe of Judah. Philippians 2:8, being found in appearance as a man, there's that word appearance again I was mentioning earlier, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So the one who himself deserved obedience from all creation came obedient. I think that's supposed to say became obedient. The question here is, did Jesus ever get to a place in his life where he wasn't obedient? Obviously not. Christian theology is taught, and the Bible teaches that Jesus was perfect. He never sinned. Even when he was, quote, tempted, it was merely the external pressure of Satan's sin and death and those things. It was never really something he thought. He never once had the thought and feeling in his heart, oh, this probably would be great. He was sinless in that way. But he became obedient, and the idea there is in his humility, he remained faithful, and that obedience bore the fruit of death. In other words, he became obedient to the point of death on a cross. So the Hebrews puts it, Paul, the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. So Jesus' obedience, it's not necessarily contrasted with disobedience, like he became obedient. He was in the realm of disobedience, but then he became obedient. That's not it. He's saying he became obedient in that he went to the cross. His obedience was marked by going to the cross. Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That's a quote from the law, from Deuteronomy. The righteous judge of all the universe placed himself under the curse of the law. He identified himself with sinful mankind. You think about the way we would believe that Jesus was obedient to the law of God, right? And usually what we mean by that is, well, he honored his parents, he honored the Sabbath, he had no other gods before himself, he didn't take God's name in vain, he actually took his name with love and joy and hope and faithfulness and all that stuff. He never stole anything, he never committed adultery, he's not prone to covetousness or any of those things. We like to think of Jesus fulfilling the law in that way, in that he was a morally upright person, which is true, obviously. But think about the fact that on the road to Emmaus, he says that all the law and the prophets is about me. Now, I would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation, because what were they talking about? What was he saying? And I have half a mind to think, we don't know the details, but I have half a mind to think, you know that verse in Deuteronomy about a cursed man, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree? Yeah, I did that too. He fulfilled the law in a literal sense. The law cursed anybody who hung on a tree. Think of Absalom, right? And his hair got caught. And somebody else, I believe in Joshua, was caught in a tree, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong. But it's the idea being, of course, that this is a gruesome death, and the cross, of course, was a scandal altogether, front to back, but it was a scandalous death. So Jesus fulfills that law. Go to Matthew in your Bibles, and I want to read Matthew 4, 1 through 11. And this is Luke 4 covers the same thing, but it's when Jesus was being tempted by Satan, the devil. Matthew 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. But he answered and said, It is written, Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Then the devil took him into the holy city and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, Again it is written, You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to the very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to minister to him. So think about that context. Then, in your papers there, Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things like we are, yet without sin. So the Holy One allowed himself to suffer every temptation that mankind can know. Consider what pain it must have been for him to be daily buffeted by the sin that permeates the world in which we live. Again, Jesus never entertained sin as though it were a reasonable option. His affections were never stirred such that he was genuinely enticed by sin in that sense, but he was surrounded by it. He lived in this world and he was tempted by the devil, and he no doubt experienced you think of the garden scene when he was pouring out his heart in prayer before the Father, and sort of Luke says he was sweats like drops of blood. Whether or not that was literal, I don't know, probably, maybe. But it looked like it, at least to them, and the agony of realizing the weight of the world is about to fall on him, and that looks like the cross. So he knew what it was like to be tempted. He knew everything about that. John 1 verse 11, he came to what was his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. So even his own brothers and sisters, the Jews, they were his ancient people. They rejected him. I'm reading through Chronicles right now, side note. And Chronicles reads so different, right, from 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings sort of just tells you that then this son and then this bad thing. You have longer portions of the narrative, like the Ahab, Jezebel, Elijah saga is a little larger. But then you just have some kind of quick hitters, and then eventually, you have the kingdom falling. But, well, it was fallen before David got in. Let's be honest. But the Chronicles sort of comes back because Chronicles is written later, and Chronicles essentially lays out, this is what God did that was glorious, and here's where those breakdowns were. And so it kind of rehearses it a little bit of a different way. And it's like reading with new eyes. You realize, oh, I'm looking back at this thing, and I realize it looks totally different than that. And the point I'm making here is this. When you're reading that, have you ever asked yourself, I thought about this earlier today, there's so much pomp and circumstance when Solomon dedicates the temple. I mean, just singing and all this celebration. And Chronicles even tracks that with David, when David's ascendancy to the king. He there's just a lot of celebration. And then you go back even further and you realize, boy, look at Leviticus and the system God put in place. Very specific way to approach him. You're supposed to burn this portion of the animal outside the camp. This is for the priest. This is for God. This is for the worshiper. And really specific questions about what it means to be a butcher, which portion of the animal goes to God, and so forth. And then you get to like the Chronicles and you realize, even after Solomon, there's almost little to no attention at all on the sacrificial system. It's just gone. And I don't know if I guess I'm bringing that up because you just wonder, how did it get to that place, for one? Obviously, sin begets sin. With a few people breaking the cycle, Hezekiahs of the world or Josiah, but overall, just bad stuff over and over again. And you wonder, well, what is this? Flip to the book of Acts, and you read in Acts 6, Stephen's sermon. And Stephen preaches all this stuff, and like 95% of his sermon is a rehearsal of Israel's history, kind of breaking down all these things happen. And then he says, and you stiff-necked people, he basically says, you're just like the people in the Old Testament who just failure after failure after failure. And then, of course, they stone him because nobody likes to be told they're a stiff-necked failure. But that's what happened. And then you get to Jesus and you realize, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, there were breakdowns baked into this. Obviously, Jesus is going to be rejected. That was a long rabbit trail. My apologies. John 7. Therefore, his brothers said to him, leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples also may see the works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself publicly to the world. For not even his brothers were believing in him. His own half-brothers, the natural children born to Mary. I don't believe in Mary's perpetual virginity, but Augustine did, and I'm intrigued by that. All of those half-brothers rejected him until after his death and resurrection. So Mark highlights the fact that this guy is insane. He's out of his mind. That's just, what do you expect? He's being rejected by people. It makes sense that he would be rejected by his own poor family. Matthew 27, 46. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? So as he hung upon the cross, having taken upon himself the sin of those who would trust him as Savior, God the Father turned from him, in the sense that Jesus experienced true suffering. His physical sufferings were obviously immense and great, intense in every sense of the word, but they weren't even necessarily the greatest part of his suffering. He experienced what it was like to be abandoned by God. Now, I don't believe God abandoned God in that sense, because even David, in quoting Psalm 22, David back there later on talks about how God never turned away from him. So, but he felt the weight of it. He understood the weight of it. Like, oh, this is what sin does. It separates you from God. That's the intensity. Luke 22, while he was still speaking, that he's in the garden, right? Crowd comes. One of them was Judas, one of the 12. And he was up front because he made a deal. The one that I kiss, that's the guy. It's dark out. You might not be able to tell. He goes to Jesus. He kisses him. And then Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? So even Judas, one of his friends, betrayed him with a kiss. Betrayal, someone you're close to, someone that you have invested in, you've spent time with, you've discipled, turns on him. And Jesus even knows what that's like. Matthew 25, but all this had taken place in order that the scriptures of the prophets would be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. So in his hour of need, the disciples left. Mark places a heavy emphasis on this because no one's there, right? I mean, Matthew does too, because they're sleeping. He's fallen, he's trying to get them to wake up. What's your deal, guys? You couldn't even stay awake. Which, hey, they probably had a lot of wine to drink at the communion meal. And so they were tired. They were very sleepy. And, of course, Jesus experiences what that abandonment looks like with all the disciples, not just Judas, but even the other 11 who were, quote, faithful, were unfaithful in that moment. We're not going to take the time to read all of that, but in Matthew 27, you have Jesus's trial with Pilate. Of course, Pilate's really the one on trial, but Jesus is on trial. He's mocked and scorned. There's a lot of humiliation in this story. Matthew tells it in his own unique way. He really wants people to see the Old Testament, and he's writing more to a Jewish type audience. But Mark really points out the absolute rejection by everybody involved. And that was part of his humiliation, is everybody rejects him. Pilate, representing the Gentiles, rejecting him. The Sanhedrin, representing the Jews, rejecting him. Everybody rejected him. And this is God who allowed himself to be treated this way. He gave his son. Of course, the promise of 2 Corinthians 5:21 is a great verse to try to memorize, He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that in him, the LSB puts that at the end, which is fine, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So he, the eternally holy one, died as sin for us. Did Jesus sin? No. Did Jesus have to die for sins he committed? No. But he was treated as sin because it was our sin. Obviously, he's the only one that could ever be capable of taking our sin because he was innocent. But he was treated as sin. He was treated as, an adulterer, a murderer, a luster, a greedy person. He was treated as all of that. And he was given the death penalty as a result. And then 1 Peter kind of rounds out this section on his humiliation. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, so that he might bring you to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, presumably preaching to those in Hades. So, like natural man, his spirit and body were unnaturally torn asunder when he died. His body rested in the grave, his soul descended into Hades. So there was the full experience. You think about, we realize, yes, Jesus experienced a real human death, right? And that's sort of the extent of it. But what happens when we die? Our body is there. Our soul is not there. It's not united. Because if it was united, we'd still be alive. We'd still have an animation about us. But when someone dies, their flesh is there, but their spirit is no longer there. And so essentially, that is the doctrine when we talk about the Apostles' Creed. Some people ignore it. And it is true, there are certain manuscripts of the early Apostles' Creed that don't have that sentence in there, but it is biblical doctrine that he descended into Hades. He went to the place of the dead, his soul did, while his body lay in the tomb. His soul went there to preach the good news. He broke down the doors and said, hey guys, you're free. And then presumably escorted them to heaven, or at least sent them there, if not escorted them. I like to think he did go to heaven, because absent from the body, present with the Lord. Did he go there, proclaim the news? Victory, victory. Hey, Father, God, his soul goes back down, and then on Easter morning, he's reunited in resurrection. I think that's true. So that's his humiliation. When we talk about the humiliation of Christ, we're not talking about him being embarrassed. We're talking about him coming very low to rescue sinners who need it. And then the exaltation of Christ. Let's go to Acts 2 if you're not already there. Acts 2, verses 25 through 31. This is Peter's sermon. Acts 2, pick it up in verse 25. For David says of him, of Jesus, I saw the Lord continually before me, because he is at my right hand, so that I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad, and my tongue exulted. Moreover, my flesh also will live in hope, because you will not forsake my soul to Hades. By the way, there's another proof text. The soul of Christ went to Hades. Nor give your Holy One over to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. This is Psalm 16:11. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. The 16:8, yeah, 16:8. Is that right? What's the cross reference on? Yeah. Anyway. Verse 29, Men, brothers, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. And so, because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to set one of the fruit of his body on his throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither forsaken to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. So, obviously a great change in the story. Through his humiliation, Christ's steps have been downward, right? Down, 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 all the way to the point of death. And then now there's this raising up, this increasing glory his body lay in the grave, but it never saw corruption. There wasn't enough time because on the third day he rose. Flip to Luke 24. Luke 24:36. Now while they were telling these things, he himself stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace to you." This is after his resurrection. But being startled and frightened, they were thinking that they were seeing a spirit. And he said to them, why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they were not believing because of their joy and were still marveling, he said to them, Have you anything to eat? I love that phrase, by the way. They were not believing because they were too joyful. This is exciting, but how? Have you anything to eat? And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it before them. How this happens in a resurrected body, I don't know, but I'm assuming we're going to eat forever. Maybe not like all the time. You know what I mean? So he ate it, and he said to them, These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about... Oh, we don't have to keep going. We stopped there anyway. Me and the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. So he, after his resurrection, there's clearly a reuniting of his soul and his body. And it wasn't just his spirit that rose from the dead. He had a body identifiable, right, with the hands and the perhaps even the scars of the beating. I don't know. Maybe he had a scar here because of the crown of thorns. Whatever the case, he was a complete man, and his body and his spirit were reunited. Now flip to John 20. Look at verse 25. And these are details that are easily ignored, so hopefully this is helpful, because we sort of read this and we don't fully think about the implications. But John 20, verse 25. So the other disciples were saying to him, We have seen the Lord. But he said to them, Unless I see with his hands and imprint of his nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, right where he was stabbed by the soldier, I, Thomas says, will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. By the way, it doesn't say that he ever touched him. He's like, I'm going to do this. Hands, feet, side, all of it. I'm not going to believe unless I touch this man. So after 8 days, they're inside. Thomas was with them. And Jesus came, the doors having been shut. Somehow he got in. Did he sneak in the window? Or did he just appear? I think he just appeared. So he can eat fish and then still go through walls. Crazy. Bring your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand here and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but be believing. But believing. Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. So we don't know that he actually touched him, but whatever the case is, his resurrection body was the same body that the disciples had known before he died. So clearly there's a continuity that's there. There's a continuity with the resurrection body, but Thomas's skepticism was obviously conquered, and it's a proof that it's a proof of the resurrection of Christ, the physical, very physical resurrection of Christ. His body came out of the garden tomb, and the body that came out was the same body that went in, but obviously different, glorified. Acts 1:3. To whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over 40 days, this is Luke's commentary, and speaking about the things concerning the kingdom of God. So Jesus, with his resurrection body, was seen from time to time, repeatedly over those 40 days, and that's, of course, a convincing proof. So he appeared to many. Remember, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says he appeared to upwards of 500 at one time. And Paul, did I say Peter? Paul, I meant Paul. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says he was the untimely born because Christ appeared to him last. So the last shall be first. Acts 1, verse 9. And after he said these things, he was lifted up while they were still looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky while he was going, behold, 2 men in white clothing stood beside them. They also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking toward heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven. So after he showed himself and revealed himself to people over those 40 days, that we have Ascension Day. He was taken into heaven. And he was taken from one place to another. There's a location thing here. Earth is here and heaven is there. So he moved from one place to another, which is one reason why I reject full preterism. Because they'll say things like, well, you've been raised with Christ. You've been seated with him. I was like, okay, but I'm not yet dead. And I know that I don't have a raised body yet. So what does he mean if I've been raised with Christ? Okay, you're seated with Christ in the heavenly places. I'm here on earth. So clearly there's a principle here that the gospel secures for you that's not yet, like there's things that are still not yet accomplished. And that's one of the reasons I think full preterism is foolish and wrong. I don't think you're going to hell automatically for believing. I just think you're really mistaken, sorely mistaken. So he went from one place to another. His baptism began his public ministry, but now his ascension showed it to be terminated or finalized or fulfilled, we might even say. The ascension, though, this is where our brother John MacArthur is with the Lord in heaven. He said that Jesus was in voluntary exile, which is a really bad way to describe a coronation ceremony. Jesus was exalted to the right hand. He fulfills Daniel 7, 13 and 14. And Daniel chapter 7, verse 14 very specifically articulates the fact that he's got a kingdom that has no end. So he's not in exile waiting. Hopefully the Father taps on his shoulder and says, okay, now you can go be king. Go kill a third of the Jews. Dispensationalism for you. But that's just side note. That one's free. You don't have to pay for that. John 14, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. In this place called heaven, Christ is preparing a place for us. And I had to insert a little comment there, to live on earth forever. Because the place that Christ is making, there's no building project in heaven. The building project is the earth. So the place that he is creating is here. And it's not that we just get to go to heaven, it's that heaven gets to come here. And that's the process of eschatology. The process of eschatology isn't us going up, it's heaven coming down. And we could go a long time into that. But that is one mistake about John 14 that people make is, oh, there's this giant hotel mansion thing in heaven, and apparently he's still swinging a hammer. No, not at all what we're talking about. Christ is building a new heavens and a new earth. Acts 2, this Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, having been exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out this which you both see and hear. So the idea of the sending of the Spirit is that the exaltation of Jesus Christ is an ongoing thing. When the Spirit's poured out, the mission continues. The campaign rages on. The victory is won. We've got work to do. There's still a cleanup operation. There's a lot to do in the world. It's a sanctifying process. I've always connected postmillennialism with the idea of sanctification, because we all believe that God intends to sanctify people. does he not intend to sanctify everything connected to people? And he does. And that is part of the process, is the work of the Holy Spirit in God's people. Ephesians 1, which he worked in Christ by raising him from the dead and seating him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things in subjection under his feet and gave himself as head over all things to the church. So the one who was spat upon and humiliated and torn asunder and crucified, dead and buried, in the eyes of sinful men, of course, he has now been exalted, and he is the head of all things. Paul says it two different ways. He is the head of the church, no doubt, but he's the head of all things. His primacy isn't just Lord of the church. That is true. He is Lord of the church, but it's more than that, and certainly not less than that. And then flip to Revelation, and we'll kind of wrap this up here. Revelation chapter 19. Verse 9. And I disagree with Schaeffer, so we're going to have to talk about that. Revelation 19, verse 9. Then he said to me, "Write, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, "These are true words of God." Then I fell at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, "Do not do that. I'm a fellow slave with you and your brothers who have the witness of Jesus. Worship God. For the witness of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." So John's told not to sit down and worship angels. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sits on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, having a name written on him, which no one knows except himself. That's ominous. And being clothed with a garment dipped in blood, his name is also called the Word of God. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the wrath of the rage of God the Almighty. And he has on his garment and on his thigh a name written, apparently a tattoo, right? King of Kings and Lord of Lords, right on his thigh. So that John can read, but he doesn't know the name, which is really, really fascinating. Now, Schaeffer connects this to the second coming of Christ. And, everybody's going to know that the one they crucified, yeah, he's actually Lord. You played yourself, ha ha. I take this to be about what God does in history. And he defeats his enemies. And you have to read this with 1 Corinthians 15, because the last enemy is death. So we're clearly talking about enemies in real time. So this is the unfolding of history. It's not the premillennial pipe dream where he comes back and then he rules and sets up this kingdom, and apparently it's 1,000 years of this. Their description of the millennial is true, but it's now. The millennial timing is off. So he is clearly treading through history, defeating his enemies. And again, 1 Corinthians 15 is actually probably one of the key texts to really dig through in eschatology. I think Paul was quite clear, actually, on that. So Christ's humiliation and his exaltation, that is it for this lesson.